to also with our topics today. I'm going to talk to you about climate change. So, what does climate change, you might ask, have to do with Indian media and culture? And maybe you have some answers to that, but then what does climate change have to do with leisure? The answers to these questions lie in the fact that climate change has nearly everything to do with consumption. And I might add, a lot to do with food. So, the evidence on climate change is unequivocal, and the reiterated recommendation to manage and maintain global temperatures below 2 degrees Celsius requires a concentrated effort in capping greenhouse gas emissions. However, when it comes to doing this, fossil fuels appear to dominate climate change discussions. As you can see, you picture industrial smokestacks or oil-thirsty planes and automobiles, and not really, pork chops or chicken wings or, steaks or whatever you may call it. But what if the real actors in climate change are these, actually? So bear with me while I set the scene here, for this, all of this may not really be common knowledge. Modern day food production consumption practices are major contributors to climate change. By one estimation, the contribution of food systems in agriculture, including pre-production, production and post-production processes tracked from fertilizer application to consumer waste generation, comes to 29% of all greenhouse gas emissions. A lot of this, in fact, 80%, is estimated to be the contribution of animal farming to agricultural emissions. That's a lot. Why? Because animal farming uses almost everything in excess. Soil, land, water, grain, all of it. You're just eating higher up the food chain, resource management becomes all the more difficult, transportation, refrigeration, etc. Now, there is another estimation, which is where this World Watch report comes from, which actually pegs, it does a life cycle analysis, and it pegs the total contribution of livestock, just animal farming, all forms of animal farming, at 51% of total greenhouse gas emissions. That's a huge figure. So anyway, before we start attributing agency to these nameless, unknown animals, let's remember that they are bred using collective, inanimate, impersonal terms such as cattle and poultry for human consumption. Food is among the most intimate forms of consumption and an essential manner of socialization. In fact, the broader patterns of food consumption, the broader patterns that support food consumption are cultural and societal in nature. It moves beyond the personal to encompass narratives, stories, concepts of purity and profanity, approval or validation by peers. Non-physiological factors have a huge bearing on what we consume and on our food behavior, and of course, probably on our identity, on how we create a form of identity through food. Not merely take momentary decisions 3 times a day on what we should eat. This permits the decision of what to consume to be guided, of course, by a larger wave of social direction and consent, in addition to mere individual preferences. And media, in this case, then, play the role of not only disseminating risk, but also reinforcing or questioning social patterns. Studies have found, and you might then ask, how do media cover risk? So, studies have found that mainstream media, in fact, do cover climate change as an impending risk, even if infrequently at times. Indian media display absolute scientific certainty when it comes to climate change, as opposed to American press, for example, American press has also evolved and moved to the frame of economic concerns and technological utopia. Indian media also presents climate change as an economic opportunity, economic challenge, energy and economic challenge, and also present climate change through the lens of a north-south divide. But the question here is, more specifically, given the scientific data on food's footprint, carbon footprint, and the need for critical action, do news media connect the dots between climate change and our routine consumption patterns, particularly food trends? Here you may ask, why is this relevant for India? Right. Meat and milk production in countries like India and China is expected to double by 2020, 5 years, not very long away, not very far away. India is the largest producer of milk. Oh, this slide hasn't come out. But if you see this big, circle right there, that's India. So it's the largest producer of milk globally, and the largest exporter of beef. This is a very interesting slide because just see where we've gone from there, right, shot all the way up in between 2008 and 12, just recently. We may not consume much of it, but we certainly meet the global demand. So Large swaths of Indian cattle account for the highest quantities of CO2 emissions through enteric fermentation. We are leading the world in producing, in allowing cattle to basically breathe out, because we just have so much industry around cattle, dairy industry. India has also started to rapidly divest itself of the tag of a predominantly vegetarian country. 31% people in a survey conducted in 2006 said that they were vegetarian, and the rest were not. So either they were vegetarians, whatever. They have a lot of factors. Other socioeconomic factors also play into the picture. We are the second fastest growing economy in the world, with some of the highest rates of purchasing power parity, youngest population in the world, rising middle class, second largest English-speaking population globally, visibly growing market for goods and services. We are purchasing greater and greater amounts of dairy and other animal products. Trends are only expected to grow. Food and beverage industry in India is expected to clock an annual growth rate of 10% to reach US $200 billion in 2015, a KPMG study found recently. Rising per capita and disposable incomes translate into greater freedom, choice and opportunity to experiment with food varieties and sustain market trends. So now that we connect the dots between our food production, consumption patterns and climate change, let's analyze 3 newspapers of record and their meaning making around climate change and food. This is a preliminary study. It's been I look at these 3 newspapers, Times of India, Hindustan Times and Indian Express. It's a short duration, between just a 3 months duration last year, just to get a feel of what the data looks like. The analysis is conducted in a quantitative and qualitative manner. I've worked with frames, categories, themes, claims makers, and developed a scale of relatedness. Frames have been developed using Entman and Entman's framing typology, and also Nisbet's put together a wonderful table on frames which is specially developed for science reporting or for climate change reporting. And in the course of my previous work, it draws on some of my previous work on food and climate change. I've developed another set of frames, identified many more. So there's almost 21 frames to look at, and then we see what comes out. So after experimenting, with a large number of keywords, and I can talk about methodology later because it'll just take up too much time right now. Basically, the search resulted in 112 articles, out of which 47 were identified as duplicates, leaving 65 articles to be coded. And this was because there were 77 publications from the Times of India banner, and there were 14 publications from Hindustan Times, and Indian Express just had its online portal. So this showed, there would have been an overlap. So anyway, the results, article distribution shows us that nearly 45 of the total unduplicated 65 articles appeared in the Times of India, leaving just 10 each in both Hindustan Times and the Indian Express. Which is, of course, so TOI is dominating the scene across the whole thing. So we need a longitudinal analysis to figure out whether Hindustan Times or Indian Express actually catch up in terms of quantity and quality. Now, this is the scale of relatedness. To explain this, let's take 5. 5 is articles. There are articles that are related to both food and climate change. Right? 4 are articles related only to climate change, not to food. 3 are articles related only to food, not to climate change. 2 are articles that mention climate change, but don't go beyond that to actually go into it. 1 article that only mention food, and 0 articles which have no bearing with either climate change or food. Now you might ask the keyword search said food and climate change. So how does this happen? Because you have, for example, articles which are, the ministerial cabinet of the Prime Minister. So you've got both food and climate change there, but that would be a 0 because it has absolutely no bearing on both the issues at hand. So now what do we find? This is just, also keep in mind that this period of study overlaps with 2 climate-related events. United Nations Climate Change Conference for the Parties held in December, beginning of December, and the 5th assessment, IPCC 5th assessment report synthesis released on 2nd November. So the primary men developed here show, you can see what they are, but I'll go a little bit deeper into it. A closer reading shows that media narratives on climate change exist, largely in a politicized manner, and as events-based episodic coverage highlighting negotiations and governance discourses. So I'm being forced almost to talk only about climate change because of the kind of data that came out, but I'll go into food a bit later. Concerns remain embedded in present and future impacts, energy and resources, while the problem solution, which is what the frames look at, centers around strategic opportunities, conflict resolution, political accountability, governance, and a call for affirmative action in a now or never scenario. So, affirmative action, take action, something needs to be done. You know, people, politicians and scientists constantly talking about this. It needs to be done now, but what needs to be done, how it needs to be done, what are the causes, why this needs to be pushed, nothing of that exists in any of the discourses. So a lot of importance is also given to personalities. You'd find up here, so the category of profile and personality, 14 articles during a 3-month period, just focused on outlining personalities and people-centric news on climate change. For example, Arnold Schwarzenegger's visit to the country and his zeal for environmental issues in an otherwise completely unrelated interview about his life journey. So now this is the men's that were developed around food. So food, as you see here, there's food security in both places, right at the end of the spectrum. I didn't bother listing the frames below 10%, it just didn't make sense. Food security is definitely a key search term. Food is a key search term, and it comes out with food security, as in climate change will have many impacts, including food security, that sort of discourse. But food is largely absent from the discourse, except to mention the impending problem of food security. As I just said, only 7 of the 65 articles were actually framed from this angle of food security. Mostly articles focused on affordability of food, obesity, world economy, food security mission of the country. The element of human activity and patterns of human consumption are simply not mentioned. I'll come to the thematic orientation. Let me just go a little more about food. So when food is mentioned, a frame of distanciation is also present. So for example, there were a couple of articles which talked about food in the context of the Ebola crisis and bushmeat and the need for awareness among tribals in India. Elitist constructions of food are not disturbed. There's need for awareness among tribals because bushmeat leads to zoonotic diseases. Right. Food and depletion of natural resources in other parts of the world finds mention. So extinction of the Pacific bluefin tuna, the American eel, sporadic mention, but distanced because of its occurrence in other parts of the world. Indian newspapers, through this preliminary analysis that I can point out here, creating a different genre of frames altogether. Another study that I did looked at Australian and US newspapers, and interestingly, even though the coverage was extremely infrequent, frames did center around consumption and lifestyle changes. We just don't see that pattern of coverage here. Not much parlay in the discourse. Instead, the papers accord agency to climate change as a third party. Shifting focus away from the anthropogenic nature of the situation, climate change is the doer, the actor, not humans. There is something from above, and I may be overstepping myself with a kind of frame of fatality almost. Now, so the thematic orientations and the claims makers just derive from the categories in the frames. Policymakers at the very top. Scientists are definitely there, simply because scientists are, issuing these unequivocal warnings which are constantly being carried in the news. However, I'd just like to say it's not as if discourses around food or meat, even meat, do not exist in the Indian press. They exist through their representation and in wellness and lifestyle sections of magazines and newspapers, touted as a health benefit or exoticized as a new trend. Right? They exist in religious and political discourse, in discussions of canteens and separation of vegetarian and non-vegetarian spaces, titled by one popular magazine as Meat Jihad. This outlook cover instantly organizes the discourse as, and I quote here, an overwhelming assault on personal freedom, liberty and nutritional choice under the watch of Modi Sarkar. And there's always a danger when you're getting into topics like this because you start talking about personal freedom. But if you unpack the food discourse here within the environmental discourse, it just does not seem to exist. So food as leisure, as a consumptive practice, receives altogether different cues. They miss the bigger picture of climate change and the environment. I'm going to end now. And at the risk of ending very provocatively and appearing to be moralizing, I'd just like to evoke some conceptualizations by ancient and modern observers of society. American economist John Kenneth Galbraith, in his book The Affluent Society, referred to post-war USA and Europe and pointed out now that the basic survival concerns of people have been met, These societies expressed a desire for more elegant cars, more exotic food, more erotic clothing, more elaborate entertainment. Right? Ramchandra Guha takes up this paradigm and develops an analytic framework presenting the asymmetries of consumption, a fundamental opposition between two groups, whom he titles the omnivores versus the ecosystem people. So omnivores, estimated in excess of 100 million, include industrialists, rich farmers, state officials, growing middle class, who have the ability, says Guha, to draw on the natural resources of the whole of India to maintain their lifestyle, as opposed to the ecosystem people who rely for the most part on the resources of their own vicinity, from a catchment of a few dozen kilometers at best. Right, it would appear that Indian elites, the omnivores, already answer to the description of post-war American society, and that's fast work and ecologically unsustainable. Right? I would argue that there is a need to study the representation of consumption, particularly food, targeted at this social group, highlighting the environmental dynamic and urgency of climate change, with accurate unidirectional information and appropriate emotional cues. People have the ability to make lifestyle assessments and the possibility of choice. Thank you.